Node 3, March 6th, Sunday morning. Last night, I went kind of crazy in meditation mode, planting a whole slew of baby aloe vera plants from Inez, the extremely large aloe vera plant we have over there. There's Romeo beside it. Then I just kind of collapsed afterwards because I was exhausted. And it was probably 10 o'clock at night by that point. I'd been planting all of it by the moonlight. And so I came out this morning to greet the sun. It was dry. And I saw this scene before me with the little unused new potting buckets. Amida Butsu, the unused water fountain at the moment. Shiva Lingam, surrounded by a mixture of ash and leftover potting soil and stuff. Durga Ma, the Ma is the kind of Mother Earth stone of the circle. A little more subtly, fire pit, representing fire. Fire is always in the sky with Krishna during the day. Of course, bells for the east, the air, Parvati. So anyway, this was all planted by the Ladasoma, and when I came out to this scene this morning and was just, I was completely struck with an image of our solar system with Durga Ma representing the sun, the most ancient of things that was around here, and it almost looked like Solar Ejecta coming outwards. And at first I thought maybe Solar Ejecta as coronal discharge, energy hitting the Shiva Lingam like it was Earth. But then I got to thinking about it, and there's all this new life now surrounding Amida Butsu, and Amida Butsu there without water, completely without water, but with all the other, basic elements of life around it, and just waiting. And it occurred to me that the giant impact hypothesis, where, I don't know, about 4 billion years ago, 4.5 billion years ago or so, the idea is that a very large Mars-sized object by the name of Theia, which I didn't know until sometime after we had named my daughter that in her middle name. Theia impacted the Earth, and that created the moon that orbits the Earth to this day. And then the image basically widened in scope, and it occurred to me that the moon, not the moon, but Theia, probably originated as a piece of Solar Ejecta, a much more solid, say Mars-sized chunk of the sun thrown out or otherwise formed by the sun to then impact Earth, and then later be peppered with additional fertilizers and things in the form of lots and lots of meteors and asteroids and whatnot afterwards, as well as additional solar discharges. And then it widened the scope further in that, since my whole study has been this whole time about non-human intelligence. And one of the things that I've had to square with that is the idea that humans are not, in fact, the dominant intelligence in the universe. Probably not even in our own solar system, maybe not even on our own planet. And we're certainly not the only one. But that all intelligence seems to work in a networked fashion, with life of a sub-informative, that is to say, either more massive and less energetic, feeding life that is less massive and more energetic. And as it scales upwards in terms of losing mass for its body and gaining in the amount of energy that it's able to transform, it gains in intelligence and evolves in intelligence as well. And humankind is only at a very small portion of this possible capability in terms of our networking. Sure, we've managed to network a great deal of humanity. Not all of it, to be sure, but a great deal of humanity. But humanity makes up a teeny tiny fraction of the current active biomass on this planet. And that's only for the current time frame. For a few tens of thousands of years, the oldest human civilization, this real technologically advanced human civilization that we can find traces of so far, most recently in the news in China, appears to be 40 million years old. That's 20 million years after the Great Flood. One of the Great Flood events. After the Yucatan Peninsula event, I believe, about 60 to 65 million years ago. Further, all traces of any dead civilization or inactive civilization are going to be gone within a scant few millions of years. The idea that we are the only terrestrial intelligence that has ever risen to the level that we're at now, much less that they stopped where we are now, is absurd. It's the greatest hubris to assume. We're a speck on a speck on a speck on a speck on a speck. And we haven't even been here for the relative amount of time, for the thought, the very thought, for the blink of an eye to occur, much less take place in the grand scheme of the universe. And everything that we have seen, from humans to ants to bees, wolves, everything operates in a greater network that supports lower mass and higher energy. All the holy scriptures I've come across emphasize this as well. Things that when we grew up as kids, we took as fact because our ministers, our priests, our elders, they told us this was the case. They told us this was how the universe operates, and we believed them, and we knew it was true. And then we get older, and we begin to have doubts. We support those doubts, and we build a whole different belief system to operate within the world, because those doubts soon become reinforced by new elders, new trusted authorities that tell us these things don't exist, that they're mere fantasy, that we were lied to throughout our entire childhood. And then we grow through adulthood. We get careers. We do the things that we have to do to raise a new generation. And then we tell those same lies to the next generation about hope, about celestials, about greater beings, about gods and goddesses and forces beyond ourselves, moralities that are intrinsic to the universe, that are incumbent upon all of us to learn, so that we could one day raise to a higher state of consciousness and being ourselves and become celestials one day. And then as the realities of the world begin to set in, they begin to doubt. And the cycle begins anew. And they find new people to reinforce those beliefs, that all those things were just fantasies, and that there is no higher power. And the circle of doubt continues, so that they're able to focus less on the celestial, less on the future, and more on the present, more on making sure that the next generation is there and ready to take up the reins of work, so that the older generation can teach the wisdom and ways of the prior generation to the children, so that they can later be taught to ignore it themselves and get through life until the day where they're allowed to consider it once again in the face of new children. I've often mentioned that the walls between religion and science and magic were completely destroyed for me in the last couple of years. I'm no longer able to fully discern reality from fantasy, except through any means other than through my own direct observation, because everything that we've been told our entire lives is either an outright lie, a fabrication to get through the daily grind, or a best guess. And every step closer that we take to figuring out what reality is, the more insane and removed it seems from what daily life tells us. All the forces that drag us down to lower energy and higher mass and lower energy. Things like the accumulation of wealth and land, stability, reputation, all those things, those are high mass, low energy. Dedicating yourself to earthly things And not that I'm condemning that. If it weren't for those who dedicate themselves to earthly things, there would be nothing to support that which feeds upon it to achieve unearthly things, celestial things. This idea seems ridiculous to Americans because we're a very capitalist, property, money-oriented, legalistic society. But we're also very new. Many people in my country forget that. We're barely 200 years old. If you go back to the countries that have been around for millennia, to the most ancient of people, these ideas are not absurd. It's built into the very fabric of their history and their society. In India, there's an entire caste called the Brahmin. And at one point in time, you had to be born into the Brahmin caste. However, it does not appear that, according to the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata, that was intended to be the case. That appeared to be something that was ordained by humans, or whatever was the human analog when the Pandavas and the Kauravas were in the midst of things. These were millions and millions of years ago in their stories, though, so probably wasn't humans. From the abilities and things dictated in the stories, probably sounds like they definitely weren't quite human, probably something more advanced. Different life form altogether, but probably somewhat similar, since they were surface dwellers and land-based, which would explain why most religions and mythologies and folklore and tales throughout history generally depict surface-dwelling creatures to have roughly the same forms. This isn't an accident. When they go back and they try and generate biological models using purely random on, off, yes, no decision trees, or maybe it was a trinary decision tree, I can't remember, but it was strictly random, as opposed to using the Darwinian forced small increments method. They found that it was basically identical in choices, with very little discrepancy here and there. This implies that there's far less order in at least some portions of the universe. Not sure where I was going with that. Anyway, the Brahmins, their whole point is to try and achieve a celestial state by contemplating them. That's their job. That's what they do all day. We don't really have much in the way of that in America. I suppose we have scientific institutions, we have research institutions, and universities and things. So I guess we do have something in that equivalent, but it's never seen in America as the destination. It's only ever seen as a transitory phase until you're somehow gaining mass with it, gaining wealth, gaining property, gaining influence and power. And that brings a very troubling thought to me. And that is, there's always the worry of whether or not the research and what it uncovers is used for benign or malign purpose. There's a famous to my generation anyway, satirist by the name of Tom Lehrer. Sang a whole song about an ex-Nazi scientist named Werner von Braun, one of the guys who helped develop the atomic bombs. One of the lines in the song says something to the effect of, "Once the rockets go up, I don't care where they come down. That's not my department," says Werner von Braun. And that is one of the biggest worries of my life, is having something that I help create or discover used to cause such destruction and fear throughout the world that it holds us ransom 3/4 of a century later, and we're able to look back over historic record and see, if perhaps not definitive proof, but strong enough evidence to suggest that we are not the only species on this planet to have done this before. I referenced the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata earlier, and they're very clear in the war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, and looking through Greek legends, Chinese legends, ancient cultures throughout the earth, all talk of massive, planet-devastating wars between their ancestors that poisoned the land, made it unlivable. It turned the people who were there to ash. Anyone who walked across it would get sick, vomit their innards, and die. The land was cursed. And when we managed to look and find some of those places that get mentioned in the historic record, like in the Indus Valley, we find evidence of nuclear blast. We find the radioactive glass, we find the concentration of ions that needs to be there for it to be about the right time range. When we see how it affects the world in historic retrospect, with floods, devastation going across the planet, forcing water high up into the mountains, freezing it there for thousands or millions of years, until liquefaction causes it to suddenly slide down and destroy everything below it till it stops again. Start that process up. But if you could go back and look where those highest floods occurred, such as the ones in far North America, and it escapes me which which area, but it's somewhere in the northwest of America. And other places as well, like the Meteoras in Greece. If you check some of those highest flood level events, and if you can trace the arc of incidents from where they go up, and you can trace back enough of that arc to find the origin of the circle, I think there you will find the impact events and greater evidence. And if this is indeed the case, if being a very big word, then it stands to reason that those impact events from nuclear weapons or fission weapons or whatever have been used in the past to cause such enormous destruction of multiple generations, millions of years on the land, well, those places were targets. That means those places were military targets. That means somewhere in there are going to be bases and records of that civilization. And if it was a military target, that meant it knew that that was an eventual threat. And probably somewhere under there is as permanent a blast-proof record of their civilization as could have been made with their technology. Now, whether or not it's long since been crumbled or ground into dust under the tectonic forces of the earth, or dug up by past peoples, archaeologists, or even just accidental finds, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of those records probably gone, or underneath the ocean, or under so much layers of soil and biomass and rock and detritus that in the millions of years since then, they're all but impossible to find unless you happen to know exactly where to dig, and you have the capacity to do so. We've already seen evidence enough of this with the Aztec and Toltec civilizations in South America. Enormous cities, very advanced technology for what we thought previously about the age, incredible city planning layouts and everything, completely lost to time because they're buried under dozens of feet of soil, trees, biomass. So that begs the final question before I close out this dispatch for Node 3, and that is, what if we had proof? What if we found it? What if we knew where to look? Would we want to? And what would it change? What would it change if it were suddenly divulged to humanity that we are not the first, but merely the last in a very long line of intelligences that gained the capacity to end their existence from the planet or to leave the planet itself for future generations of life? What would that mean? And how would the Earth react? Would we end our wars? Or would we start them? This is Node 3, signing off.